Welcome to the Eric Brady podcast, Series 1, Adolf Hitler, His Bombers and Me. Episode 26, The Wooden Box. Eric, after you came home from hospital, you started to piece together what had happened in the bombing of Sandhurst Road School and afterwards. Tell us about that.
After a while, I started asking my mother to tell me more about the school and saying that I wanted to actually go back to it. My mother did her utmost to dissuade me from going back to see what the school was looking like now. And then one day she said, well, come upstairs and I'll tell you about the school. So leaving Eddie in the garden, we went upstairs to the parents' bedroom. And from the wardrobe, my mother pulled out a large wooden box. She unlocked it and said, this is what we got of Kitty's possession from the school. And she produced some newspaper cuttings of the time of the school, pictures that were taken on the day. There's a photograph from a newsreel and various newspapers detailing about the school, the aftermath, the funeral, and with various pictures, some of which are in my possession still. So my mother then started showing me more of the box, and there's a small ringlet of wool and cloth, and she said that was Kitty's bracelet that she had made and was wearing at the school. She told me various things about the school that she'd heard from Miss Clark, the headmistress there at the time, the way she had been speaking to Kitty in the hall, heard the beginning of an air raid siren and sent Kitty down to the dining area where most of us were to tell the teacher to get us to the shelter that the bomb hit, as almost as Kitty came into the dining area and before the teacher could get us to the shelters. And that was when the teacher called out that we were to get under the tables. And my mother said that Kitty had been killed straight away, a yard or two away from me, and she had died instantly. But in the newspaper cutting, it said that Kitty had been one of those who died in hospital. My mother hurriedly said that Kitty had been knocked unconscious. And so though the newspaper was right that Kitty had actually died in hospital, she had known nothing of that because she was knocked out. I hope that was true. It was at that time when we were looking through the box that my mother told me about foster parents wanting to adopt Kitty and the circumstances of that. The foster parents wrote to my mother suggesting that what they would be perfectly willing to do would be for my parents to write out consent for them to adopt Kitty if anything happened to my parents. And they sent that in a letter to my mother. And when my mother told me about that, she said to me, wasn't that an awful thing to do? But to me, even though I was about 11, I suppose at the time, to me it was a sensible thing to do. But anyway, my mother thought it was awful, and that was the reason why as soon as she could, when my father had become ill in March 1942 with double pneumonia, that she took Kitty home from her foster parents and kept her at home afterwards, even when my father recovered. Though my mother went to the grave every day for some time after Kitty was killed, that had died off over the period. And then one day we did go, my mother and Eddie and myself. We took away the old flowers and looked at the grave. There was not only Kitty's, but others of the children that were killed. Family of one of the teachers that was killed had agreed that she could be buried with the children. And over the time, a really nice, understated memorial, as it were, had been built, and each of the children had their name either at the top or the bottom, because of course the coffins had been fairly small as they were children. And my sister's name was there. Some of the parents had put a photograph in a jam jar upside down. I thought that was rather nice, but my mother thought that was awful. And what had happened, all photos of Kitty had been taken down at home after she was killed, but one was preserved in that box, which I still have. When we were going through the box, there's a photograph of the funeral procession, and after contingent of soldiers and scouts and guides and home guard, the relatives that were in the parade as well, the procession, my parents were in the lead, with my father supporting my mother on one side and a clergyman on the other, because my mother had gone blind. I think that that was probably psychosomatic as a result of what she had seen at the school when she first arrived there. She later recovered her sight to a large degree, so that by the time I came home, she got most of her eyesight back, but at the time of the funeral, so I understand, she was blind. At that point, Eddie, who'd been downstairs, suddenly came running upstairs to shout out, "What were we doing?" And my mother slammed the lid of the box down, locked it, pushed it back into the wardrobe and said, "I never want to see that again or talk about this again." And then a while later, I'd kept on about going to the school to see it. And finally, my mother said, "Well, ask your father," expecting that I would, because I was rather nervous of him still, that I wouldn't go to that extent, but I did. I insisted on us going. And my mother came with Eddie as well, but in the end didn't go to the school. She sat on a garden wall 100 yards away or so. And I went to the school with my father, and I looked through the fencing that had been put up. The school had been neatened up, so the floorboards that had been hanging down in one of the photos from the school had been cleared up, and ends of classes bricked up, and the remnants of the school were still being used as a school. And I had the only talk I ever had with my father about that school and what had happened, and from his point of view. And I never spoke to him about it again. He didn't want me to speak to him either.
To buy your copy of Adolf Hitler, His Bombers and Me to read alongside the series, go to ericbradybooks.co.uk. The Eric Brady podcast can be found on YouTube, podcast services, and at ericbrady.blogspot.com.